Somewhere in Chicago tonight there is a 4-year-old boy fighting to stay alive, and the only thing standing between him and death is a stranger he has never met. For 2 straight years one man showed up every single month, gave away part of his own blood, and then went back to mopping floors in the same hospital, 3 floors below the child he was quietly keeping alive. He never asked who the boy was. He never asked for a single dollar. And the billionaire father of that dying child walked past this man almost every day of those 2 years, without ever once looking at his face. Then one night the truth came out, in the worst possible way, and what the father did next would either heal a wound most people never even notice, or prove that some kinds of blindness run too deep to fix. Stay with me, because this story is about to show you exactly how easy it is to save someone's life, without ever being seen doing it, and exactly how easy it is to walk past the person saving you. Chicago in late autumn has a particular kind of cold, the wind coming straight off the lake, with nothing standing in its way, and it was on one of those cold mornings that this story really begins. Samuel Dawson was 42 years old the first time a nurse told him his blood was special. He had just finished a 12-hour night shift at Lakeside Children's Hospital on the north side of Chicago, the kind of shift that left his feet aching in shoes that had been worn thin for months, and his hands cracked from hospital-grade sanitizer. Instead of heading home to his small apartment on the south side, he turned down the quiet hallway most visitors never noticed, and walked into the hospital blood bank. The nurse at the desk, a woman named Diane Foster, who had drawn his blood a dozen times by then, smiled when she saw him. "Back again," she said, like clockwork. She tied the band around his arm, and told him what she always told him, that his blood type, AB negative, was carried by less than 1% of people in the entire country, that the hospital was always short of it, always desperate for it, and that most donors, with his type did not show up more than once or twice a year, let alone every single month. Samuel watched the needle slide into his arm, and did not flinch. He never did. "Do you ever wonder who gets it?" Diane asked him once. "Your blood, I mean." "We are not allowed to tell you. Donor confidentiality. Once it leaves this room it gets tested, and typed and shipped out to wherever it is needed, and you will never know whose body it ends up living inside, and they will never know it came from you." Samuel shook his head slowly. "I do not need to know," he said. "My wife used to say something. She used to say that blood is the one thing rich folks and poor folks carry in exactly the same amount, and that when you give it away, you are giving away life itself, plain and simple." He did not say it like a man reciting a proverb. He said it the way a person says something they believe all the way down in their bones. To understand why Samuel Dawson gave away a piece of himself every single month for free, you have to go back further than that blood bank, back to a much smaller apartment in the Bronzeville neighborhood, where a young man, who had once dreamed of becoming a doctor, fell in love with a woman named Angela. Samuel's family had come up to Chicago 3 generations earlier, from Mississippi, part of the great wave of black families, who left the segregated South looking for work in the stockyards, and the steel mills, and a chance at something better, and his grandmother, a woman who raised 6 children in 2 rooms, and never once complained about it, used to tell him that a person's worth was never measured by what they owned, only by what they were willing to give away, when nobody was watching. Samuel carried that sentence with him all the way into his second year of medical school at the University of Illinois, where he met Angela in the library, while he was supposed to be studying anatomy, and she was supposed to be grading essays for the education program. They married 2 years later. 3 years after that, Angela was diagnosed with acute leukemia, and for the next 18 months Samuel watched his wife survive on transfusion after transfusion of blood donated by strangers she would never meet, strangers who would never know her name, who gave up an hour of their day, so that a woman they had never seen could have one more week of living. Samuel remembered the wedding day more clearly than almost anything else in his life, a small ceremony in a church basement on the south side, with folding chairs, and a cake his grandmother baked herself, and Angela laughing so hard during the vows that the pastor had to pause and wait for her to catch her breath, and he remembered thinking, standing there in a borrowed suit, that whatever happened next in his life, he had already gotten the best part of it. She taught 4th grade at a public school 2 blocks from their apartment, and she used to say that teaching and medicine were really the same profession wearing different clothes, because both jobs were just about noticing when somebody needed help, before they had the words to ask for it. When the diagnosis came, the bills arrived faster than either of them could track them. Hospital stays that cost more in a single week than Samuel earned in half a year, medications that ran $400 a bottle, and a mounting stack of paperwork that Samuel kept in a shoebox, because he could not bear to look at the total all at once. He left medical school to care for her. He sold the only car they owned. He drained every dollar of their savings account. And when Angela finally died on a gray October morning, Samuel did not go back to school, partly because he no longer had the money, and partly because some part of him no longer had it in him either. He needed to stay close to the place where healing happened, even if he was never going to be the one doing the healing, so he got certified as a nursing assistant, because it was the fastest credential available, and hospitals were always hiring. He told himself that during those 18 months, dozens of strangers had given blood, so his wife could have more days on this earth, and that the least he could do, for the rest of his life, was become that stranger for somebody else. He had the rare type. He had the reason. So every month, quietly, without telling a soul at work, Samuel gave away a piece of himself to people he would never meet, and he never once regretted it, not even on the nights when his own body was running on empty. At Lakeside Children's Hospital, Samuel's official title was Certified Nursing Assistant, which meant he changed bed linens, and emptied bedpans, and took vital signs, and helped sick children eat when their hands were too weak to hold a spoon. He made $15.40 an hour, which in a city like Chicago barely covered rent, and he was, in the particular and painful way that low-wage hospital workers often are, almost completely invisible. Doctors walked past him in hallways, as if he were part of the wallpaper. Families spoke about him in front of him, as though he could not hear a word. And his direct supervisor, a man named Roger Ellis, who ran the night shift, with the rigid efficiency of someone who believed kindness was a waste of billable minutes, made sure Samuel never forgot exactly where he stood in the hierarchy of that building. Roger had transferred to Lakeside from a hospital in Ohio 2 years earlier, and from his very first week supervising the night shift, something about Samuel seemed to sit wrong with him, something Roger never said out loud, but that showed up in 100 small ways. Roger gave Samuel the heaviest patient loads on the floor, while giving lighter loads to newer white employees with less experience. He once told a visiting doctor, within earshot of Samuel, that people like him were lucky to have steady work at all, given the neighborhood he probably came from. Samuel was not the only one who noticed the pattern. A younger CNA named Terrence Boyd, barely 23 years old, and still paying off his own certification classes, had complained quietly to Samuel more than once that Roger scheduled him for the heaviest rooms every single week, while a newer white employee, with half his experience, got the lighter hallway. There was also a day shift nurse named Patricia Long, a soft-spoken woman originally from a small town downstate, who had worked at Lakeside for nearly 15 years, and who always made a point of greeting Samuel by name in the hallway, asking about his mother, treating him like a colleague rather than furniture, and who once told him quietly that she had reported Roger's comments to Human Resources herself, twice, and had been told both times that there was not enough evidence to take action. Samuel never said anything back to Roger directly. He had learned a long time ago that arguing with the man who controlled your schedule and your paycheck was a luxury he could not afford, not with his mother, Ruth Dawson, 67 years old, and fighting late-stage kidney disease back home, needing dialysis 3 times a week, and medication that cost more than Samuel made in 2 full days of work. There was one incident, roughly a year before the crisis, that Samuel never forgot. A night when the wealthy parents of a patient in a private room complained that a strange man had been standing too close to their son's bed, and Roger marched down the hallway and, without asking Samuel a single question first, ordered him in front of the family to empty his pockets right there in the corridor, as though the only explanation for a black man standing near a sick child could be theft. And when nothing turned up except a spare pair of gloves and a granola bar, Roger simply told him to get back to work, offering no apology to Samuel, and no correction to the family, who had made the accusation in the first place. Samuel had stood there that night with his pockets turned out under the fluorescent lights, saying nothing, because saying something back then would have cost him a paycheck he could not afford to lose, and he carried that memory quietly for the rest of the year, the particular humiliation of being searched in public for a crime that existed only in somebody else's imagination. 3 floors above the blood bank, where Samuel gave away pieces of himself every month, a very different world existed inside Lakeside Children's Hospital, a wing with imported linens and leather recliners, and a view straight out over Lake Michigan that most people in Chicago would never see from that particular angle. This was the private pediatric wing, and in one of its largest rooms a 4-year-old boy named Elijah Hartman spent his afternoons watching cartoons, while a bag of dark red blood dripped slowly into a line taped to his tiny arm. Elijah's father, Julian Hartman, was 46 years old, and worth, according to every business magazine that had ever profiled him, roughly $4.2 billion. Julian had grown up middle class in a suburb outside Cleveland, and he had built Beacon Diagnostics after watching a childhood friend die of a blood disorder that went undiagnosed for almost a full year, because nobody could piece together the symptoms fast enough, and he had spent 2 decades since then convinced that if a machine could simply read the patterns faster than a tired, overworked doctor could, thousands of children like his friend would never have to die waiting for a correct diagnosis. It was, by every measure the business world used, an extraordinary success, and it was also, Julian was slowly beginning to understand, completely useless in the one room that mattered most to him. Julian had already poured millions into blood drive campaigns and donor recruitment programs across the city, billboards, mobile donation buses parked outside sports stadiums, matching cash incentives for employers who gave their staff paid time off to donate, and every single one of those programs had helped, in a general sense, without ever once being able to guarantee a steady supply of one specific type in one specific hospital, because no amount of funding could reach into a stranger's arm and change what ran through their veins. Julian also traveled constantly, splitting his weeks between Chicago and Beacon Diagnostics' second office outside Boston, and more often than anyone realized, including Julian himself, he was catching a late flight home, or collapsing into a few hours of sleep at his own apartment during the exact hours when Elijah was most often awake, and most often afraid of the dark, which was precisely why, for 2 years, the 2 men, whose lives were now permanently tangled together, had never once crossed paths in that hospital hallway. Julian had built a company called Beacon Diagnostics, from nothing, a business that used artificial intelligence to detect rare pediatric diseases early, technology that had already been credited with saving the lives of more than 12,000 children across dozens of countries. His face had been on the cover of national business magazines. He had spoken on stages in front of world leaders. And his own son was dying of a disease his billions of dollars could not touch. Elijah had a condition called autoimmune hemolytic anemia, in which his own immune system attacked and destroyed his red blood cells faster than his small body could replace them. Without regular transfusions of a very specific and very rare blood type, AB negative, Elijah's organs would begin shutting down within weeks. 1 bag of matched blood a month was the only thing keeping him alive, and Julian Hartman, a man who could apparently build any piece of technology he wanted, could not manufacture a single drop of the one thing his son actually needed. How is it possible, Julian asked the hospital's head of pediatric hematology, a doctor named Susan Reynolds, that I can fund a company saving children in 47 countries, and I cannot guarantee a reliable blood donor for my own son? Dr. Reynolds looked at him with the calm patience of someone who had delivered hard truths for 20 years. Because blood does not care about net worth, Mr. Hartman, she told him. It only cares about compatibility. We cannot manufacture it. We cannot force anyone to give it away. All we can do is hope the right person keeps showing up. Dr. Reynolds had spent 22 years in pediatric hematology, ever since losing a younger brother to a blood disorder back when she was still in nursing school herself, and she had learned a long time ago that the families who arrived at Lakeside with the most money were often the ones most shocked to discover that their wealth meant absolutely nothing in a system built entirely on the generosity of strangers. And some part of her, watching Julian pace his son's room night after night, understood that the lesson he was about to learn was one she had watched 100 other parents learn before him, usually far too slowly. Dr. Reynolds knew exactly who that person was. Other donors occasionally filled the gaps, a handful of names scattered across the 2 years, but one name appeared on the log far more often than any other, month after month, more reliably than the hospital had ever recorded, from a single walk-in donor before. But donor confidentiality was a promise the entire blood supply system was built on, and Susan Reynolds took that promise seriously enough, that she looked Julian directly in the eye, and told him only this much, that his son's most consistent donor had rarely missed a month, and that she would very likely be there again soon, because she almost always came back. Julian did not catch the slip in pronoun. He was too focused on his son, and too humbled by the terrible realization that all his money and all his technology could not do what one anonymous person, somewhere in that same building, was doing for absolutely nothing in return. Dr. Reynolds never once connected the two of them herself. Custodial assignments were not something a hematologist tracked, and Samuel had simply been rotated onto the 7th floor, that year the same way he was rotated onto any other floor, a scheduling decision made by an entirely different department for entirely unrelated reasons, which meant that whatever happened next between Samuel and Elijah happened by accident, not design. It was on a quiet Tuesday, close to midnight, that Samuel first met Elijah, though at the time neither of them had any idea what already connected them. Samuel was pushing his cleaning cart down the 7th floor hallway, when he reached the door of the largest room on the wing. He knocked softly. There was no answer, so he pushed the door open just enough to check, and found a small boy sitting bolt upright in the dark, eyes wide with fear, the blue glow of a heart monitor the only light in the room besides a small night light shaped like a rocket ship. "I cannot sleep," the boy whispered. "It is too dark, and the beeping scares me." Samuel had 13 more rooms on his list that night, and Roger Ellis had made it very clear during a write-up 3 weeks earlier that Samuel's job was to clean rooms, not comfort patients, that comforting patients was what nurses were paid to do, and Samuel was not a nurse. Samuel parked his cart in the hallway anyway, walked back inside, and sat down in the chair beside the bed. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "Elijah," the boy said. "Well, Elijah, I am Samuel, and I will tell you what, how about I sit here a few minutes, just until you feel sleepy, would that be all right?" The boy nodded, small and grateful. Samuel told him about fishing with his own father on a river outside a small town in Mississippi long before Samuel was even born, about how the cicadas sounded on a summer night down there, about his grandmother, who used to say that a river remembers every single person who was ever kind to it. Elijah listened until his eyes grew heavy, and just before sleep finally took him, he reached under his pillow and pulled out a piece of paper, a crayon drawing of a stick figure with brown skin and enormous hands cupped around a bright red heart. "This is the blood man," he said, holding it up. "He comes every month. I do not know who he is, but my daddy says somebody gives me their blood, so I can be strong, so I call him the blood man." Something shifted quietly in Samuel's chest, though he had no way of understanding why. "Do you think the blood man knows he is saving me?" Elijah asked, his voice already fading towards sleep. "I am sure he does, sweetheart," Samuel told him, "and I am sure he is happy to do it." Elijah smiled and closed his eyes, and within a minute he was asleep, and Samuel tucked the blanket around his shoulders, and quietly rolled his cart back into the hallway, having no idea that the child he had just tucked in was the exact same child he had been keeping alive for nearly 2 years. Over the following months Samuel found himself stopping by room 714 most nights that Elijah was awake, telling him about the steel mills his great-grandfather worked in, about the sound of the elevated train rattling past the old apartment on Saturday mornings, about a dog his family kept when he was a boy that used to howl along with the radio, and Elijah started saving little drawings for him the way other children save allowance money, tucking them under his pillow one at a time. There had even been one earlier scare, 4 months before the crisis, that would change everything, a night when the hospital's supply of AB negative ran dangerously low, and Dr. Reynolds spent 6 tense hours calling every donor on record before a delivery arrived from a hospital in Milwaukee, with barely an hour to spare, a close call that nobody outside the hematology department ever heard about, and that Julian himself did not learn about until much later, once he finally understood exactly how thin the margin around his son's life had always been. Around that same time, Samuel drove out to see his mother on one of his rare days off, and found her thinner than she had looked the month before, and when he mentioned, carefully, that he was thinking about picking up a 7th shift a week to help cover her next round of treatment, Ruth set down her cup of tea, and told him, in the same firm voice she had used to raise him, that she had not spent 67 years on this earth to watch her only son work himself into the ground on her account, and that whatever he decided to do, with his body, and his time, he had better not let her sickness be the reason he stopped giving blood to whoever needed it, because that was not the man she had raised him to be. Samuel had argued weakly, that her health came first, and Ruth had simply looked at him across the small kitchen table, and said that helping a stranger, and helping your own mother were never actually two different things, they were the same thing wearing two different faces, and he should stop trying to choose between them, as though one cancelled out the other. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, without warning. Elijah had eaten breakfast that morning and drawn pictures at noon, but by 2 o'clock his skin had turned the color of old paper, and his breathing had gone shallow, and fast and wrong. Dr. Reynolds was paged immediately, and by the time she reached the room, and read his blood panel, her face told Julian everything, before she said a single word. "He is in hemolytic crisis," she said. "His body is destroying red blood cells faster than we have ever recorded in him. His hemoglobin is dropping by the hour." "Then transfuse him," Julian said, gripping the bed rail, so hard his knuckles turned white. "We do not have the blood, Mr. Hartman," she said. Those 5 words landed like a physical blow. "We have called every regional blood bank, within 200 miles. Nobody has AB negative in stock right now. Nobody. This is a $400 million hospital," Julian said, his voice cracking. "You are telling me you cannot find one bag of blood?" "I am telling you that money cannot create blood that does not exist," Dr. Reynolds said, and for the first time, since Julian had known her, her composure nearly broke. That same night, 2 floors below, 2 nurses hurried past Samuel, while he restocked a supply closet, their voices low, and urgent in the way hospital staff talk, when something has gone badly wrong. "Pediatric wing on 7, one of them said. 4-year-old in hemolytic crisis. They have called every blood bank in the region, and there is no AB negative anywhere." Samuel set down the sheets in his hands. His heart began beating in a way it had not beaten in a very long time, not fast, but loud and deep, the way it beats when a person understands something with total certainty. He had donated blood exactly 3 weeks earlier. Hospital guidelines required at least 8 weeks between donations, a full 56 days, and Samuel was only at day 21. Donating again this soon could leave his iron dangerously low. It could make him dizzy, weak, even put his own health at real risk. He knew every one of those rules by heart. He also knew that somewhere above him, a child was dying, because nobody else in an entire city of nearly 3 million people had what he had inside his own body. He walked straight to the blood bank. "You are not due for another 5 weeks, Diane Foster told him, startled to see him back so soon. "I know," he said. "I heard you need AB negative. I have it. Take mine." "I cannot, in good conscience, without a doctor signing off," she said. "Your levels might not have recovered yet. If I draw you now, and you crash, I am putting you at real risk." "I understand the risk," Samuel said, his voice steady and calm. "I am asking you anyway." Dr. Reynolds was paged, and when she arrived, and looked at the man standing in front of her, faded scrubs, worn shoes, offering up his own body for a child he did not even know existed, something shifted behind her eyes, something heavy and complicated, because she alone in that room knew exactly whose son this blood was for. "You understand what this could cost you?" she asked quietly. "I do," he said. "I still need to do it." Dr. Reynolds signed off on an emergency screening protocol reserved for exactly this kind of shortage, rapid infectious disease testing, that could clear a unit for use in hours instead of the usual day or 2, still following every safety standard the hospital required, just faster, and she personally walked the sample to the lab herself to make sure nothing sat in a queue longer than it had to. She nodded, and pulled out a chair. The needle went in. Samuel closed his eyes, and let his grandmother's words move through him like a heartbeat. Blood is the one thing rich folks and poor folks share in the exact same amount, and when you give it away, you give away life itself. But while Samuel sat in that donation chair growing dizzy and pale, Roger Ellis was already storming through the hallway on the third floor looking for him, furious that an entire section of rooms had been left half cleaned during his shift. When Roger finally found out where Samuel had gone, and why, he did not see an act of extraordinary courage. He saw an employee who had walked off his post without permission, and something in Roger, some resentment that had been simmering for 2 years, finally found its excuse. Outside the windows, a wet Chicago snow had started falling over the lake, the kind of late-season snow that never quite settles, and Samuel would remember for years afterward how strange it felt to walk out of a room where he had just given away part of himself, and into a hallway that suddenly felt colder than it had an hour earlier. He was waiting outside the blood bank when Samuel stepped out, unsteady on his feet, a small bandage taped inside his elbow. "You left your section," Roger said, loud enough for 2 passing nurses to hear. "There was an emergency," Samuel said. "A child needed blood, and I have the type they needed." "I do not care what you think you have," Roger snapped. "You do not get to decide. Your job does not matter tonight. I have been waiting for a reason, and you just handed me one." Terrence Boyd was standing near the supply closet, and heard the whole exchange, and later told Patricia Long that Roger's voice had a satisfaction in it that had nothing to do with hospital policy, and everything to do with something Roger had clearly been carrying for a very long time. Security was called before Samuel could even finish explaining himself, and in front of colleagues he had worked beside for years, Roger Ellis suspended him on the spot, pending a formal review, and told him not to come back onto the floor until Human Resources had made a decision, and when Samuel, still dizzy from the donation, tried to calmly explain that a child upstairs had needed exactly the blood type running through his own veins, Roger cut him off, and said that everybody always had a sympathetic story ready when it was convenient. What Samuel did not know that night, and would not learn until much later, was that Roger sat down at his own desk less than an hour afterward, and typed up an incident report claiming Samuel had been insubordinate and dishonest about where he had gone, a version of events that left out the blood bank entirely, and attached a recommendation that Human Resources terminate him outright, a recommendation that would have gone through quietly, the way these things usually did, if nobody with real power had ever thought to ask questions about it. Everyone on the floor would spend the following days simply saying that Roger had fired him because a suspension, with a termination recommendation already filed, felt, to everyone living through it, exactly the same as being fired, even if the paperwork technically said otherwise. As Samuel turned to leave, humiliated and still lightheaded, Roger added one more sentence under his breath, low enough that only Samuel heard it, something about people like him never knowing how to follow simple rules. Samuel did not argue. He walked out of the hospital that had been his whole world for years, past the same billboard he passed every morning advertising Beacon Diagnostics and its promise to save children's lives, climbed into his car in the empty employee parking lot, and sat there in silence as the adrenaline wore off, and the full weight of what had just happened landed on him all at once. He had just given away blood that could put his own health in danger, in the middle of the night, for a child he had never even met, and in return he had lost the only job keeping his mother's medical bills paid. He put his forehead against the steering wheel and, for the first time in 3 years, allowed himself to cry, the ugly, uncontrollable kind of crying that comes from a body that has been carrying too much for too long. 3 floors above him, Elijah's blood arrived just in time. Dr. Reynolds carried the bag up herself, refusing to trust it to anyone else, and hung it, and started the line, and within an hour Elijah's breathing slowed into something steady, and his color began returning to his small face. Julian pressed his forehead to his son's hand, and could not speak, overwhelmed with a relief, so enormous it had taken his words away completely. He had no idea that the man, who had just saved his son's life for the second time, that year had, in that very same hour, been suspended from his job, with a termination recommendation already sitting on a desk somewhere, and sent out of the building like he had done something wrong instead of something extraordinary. The truth found Julian 3 nights later, entirely by accident. He had come back to the hospital unable to sleep, unable to stop replaying the words "we do not have the blood," and he was walking toward the elevator, when he passed an open door, and overheard 2 nurses talking in hushed, angry voices. "Cannot believe Roger fired him," one of them said. "The man who has been the only reliable AB negative donor this hospital has had in 2 years, gave blood early against every guideline, because a kid was dying, and Roger throws him out like he stole something." Julian stopped walking entirely. "His name was Samuel," the other nurse said. 24 donations in 24 months. Never missed once. "And you know Roger has had it out for him, since the day he started, always did, we all saw it." Julian stood frozen in that hallway, his heart pounding, so loudly he was certain the nurses could hear it, from across the room. Samuel. AB negative. 24 donations. Fired. His son's life. A man he had probably walked past 100 times, without ever learning his name. He walked straight to Dr. Reynolds' office, even though it was nearly midnight, and knocked until she answered. "I know who he is," Julian said. "I overheard 2 nurses. His name is Samuel. And I know what happened to him 3 nights ago." Dr. Reynolds sat down slowly, her face unreadable for a long moment. "What happened to him 3 nights ago," she said quietly, "should never have happened at all, and I intend to make sure the hospital board knows every detail of it by morning." She told Julian things that were not medical secrets, things anyone at Lakeside could have told him, if he had ever bothered to ask, that Samuel had once been a medical student, that he had left school to care for a wife, who later died of leukemia, that he had been giving away blood every month, since her death, as a way of honoring the strangers, who had once done the same for her, that his mother was fighting kidney failure, and that he was working himself to exhaustion to cover her bills. And that 3 nights earlier he had broken every donation guideline in the book, risking his own health, to save a child he did not even know was Julian's son, and had been fired for it on the spot by a supervisor, who had clearly been looking for an excuse for a very long time. Julian sat in silence, thinking about the $4,200,000,000 company, with his name on it, the one whose entire slogan promised to save children's lives, through technology, and about the man, who had actually kept his son alive using nothing but a needle, and his own body, and a belief that you do not get to walk past someone who is dying just because helping them is not convenient. He found Samuel's address through the hospital's human resources office the next morning, and drove there himself, standing outside a modest apartment building on the south side, until Samuel came down to check his mailbox. "Are you Samuel Dawson?" Julian asked. Samuel looked at the man in the expensive coat, and felt his stomach tighten, because when strangers know your full name, it is rarely good news. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Julian Hartman," the man said. "I have a son named Elijah. He is 4 years old. He has been a patient at Lakeside for over 2 years, and for 2 years, someone has been keeping him alive by giving blood every single month, completely anonymously. 3 nights ago, that same person broke every rule in the book to save him during an emergency, and was fired for it, that same night. It was you, Samuel. You are the one." Samuel felt the ground shift beneath him even, though nothing physical had moved at all. "Your son," he said quietly. "What room is he in?" "Room 714, Julian said. 7th floor." Samuel closed his eyes. "The one with the rocket ship night light," he said. "I clean that room on nights. I sat with him once, when he could not sleep. He talks about someone he calls the Blood Man," Julian said, and his voice broke slightly. "He drew a picture of him once, brown skin, big hands, holding a heart." Samuel felt something crack wide open inside his chest. "That is me," he whispered. "I am the Blood Man." Julian stood there on that sidewalk and, without planning to, lowered himself down onto one knee, not to thank Samuel, but almost as an apology delivered, with his entire body. "I have walked past you," he said. "Maybe 100 times, in the hallway, near the elevator, outside my son's room, and I never once really looked at you. You were keeping my son alive, and I did not even know your name, and 3 nights ago a man I employ, a man running my son's own hospital wing, threw you out, into the street the very same night you saved his life, and I am the one, who let that happen, because I never once thought to ask, who was actually saving him." "Please stand up," Samuel said quietly, and reached down to help him to his feet, the way he would help a patient, gently, without judgment of any kind. They stood there together in the cold morning light, 2 men from entirely different worlds, both crying, neither one needing to explain exactly why. "I want to help you," Julian said once he had gathered himself. "I want to pay for your mother's transplant. I want to get your job back, with full back pay. I want to fund whatever you need, name it, and I will make it happen today." Samuel shook his head slowly. "I do not want your money, Mr. Hartman," he said. Julian blinked, caught off guard, because in his entire world, everyone wanted something. "If I take a payment for blood," Samuel said, "it stops being a gift, and becomes a transaction, and my wife taught me, that blood is sacred, not something you sell, not to you, not to anyone." "Then what do you want?" Julian asked, "because I cannot simply walk away from this." Samuel looked back toward the hospital rising behind him in the distance. "You want to thank me," he said, "then fix what is broken in that building. Not just what happened to me. Every aide, every cleaner, every transporter, every person who holds a scared child's hand at 3 in the morning, and gets paid almost nothing for it, and never gets seen by the people who run the place. And you should know exactly why I was fired, because it was not really about leaving my section. It was about a supervisor, who had a problem with me long before that night, the kind of problem that had nothing to do with my work, and everything to do with the color of my skin. If you really want to thank me, start there, because I am far from the only one it happens to." Julian went straight to the hospital board that same afternoon, and an internal investigation was opened into Roger Ellis before the sun had even set. Nurses who had stayed quiet for 2 years suddenly had somewhere safe to speak, describing years of unequal treatment, harsher discipline for black staff members, and remarks Roger had made that nobody had ever felt safe enough to report. Roger was suspended pending review, and when Julian confronted him directly in a small conference room, Roger's first instinct was to deny everything, to insist he had only ever enforced the rules fairly, that Samuel had broken protocol, and deserved to be let go regardless of the circumstances. "You fired the one person keeping my son alive," Julian told him, his voice shaking, with a kind of anger he rarely allowed himself in business meetings, "and you did it the same night he saved him, and every single person on that floor knew exactly why, even if you never said the word out loud in front of witnesses." Roger opened his mouth to argue that this was not about race at all, that it was about following procedure, and Julian simply slid a folder of statements across the table, and told him to read every page, before he said another word in his own defense. Terrence Boyd gave a statement describing 2 years of unequal assignments, and comments about his neighborhood, and his accent. Patricia Long produced the 2 human resources complaints she had filed years earlier, complaints that had gone nowhere at the time, but now sat on the table, as proof that this had never been a single bad night, only the first time anyone, with real power had bothered to look closely. And when the Human Resources Office finally pulled the actual file, it became clear that Roger's incident report never once mentioned a dying child, or a blood bank at all, only a vague and misleading account of an employee abandoning his post, a version of the truth that fell apart the moment anyone compared it against the blood bank's own time-stamped records. It took Dr. Reynolds reading the personnel complaints aloud, one after another, years of them, patterns nobody had connected, until now, for something in Roger to finally break. He sat in that room and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, stopped defending himself, and simply listened, and somewhere in the middle of that silence, the man who had spent 2 years finding reasons to make Samuel Dawson's life harder finally understood what he had actually done, not just to one employee on one bad night, but to a man who had risked his own health to save a dying child, and been thrown away for it like he did not matter at all. Roger Ellis was removed from his supervisory position, placed on probation, and required by the hospital board to complete a full year of mandatory bias and diversity training along with weekly sessions with a therapist who specialized in exactly this kind of reckoning, none of which erased what he had done, but all of which meant the change taking shape in him was slow and supervised rather than instant. Only after several months of that probation did he ask, through Dr. Reynolds, for the chance to apologize to Samuel directly, and Samuel, who had every reason in the world to refuse, agreed to hear him out. Roger came to Samuel's apartment that following spring, months into his therapy and his training, and stood in the doorway unable to look him in the eye at first, and told him that he had grown up in a house where prejudice was simply the air everyone breathed, that his own father had once forbidden him from bringing a black coworker home for dinner, and Roger had never once questioned that rule as a boy, had simply absorbed it the way a child absorbs everything a parent hands them, without examining it, and that he had told himself for years, as an adult he was not like that he treated everyone the same, right up until a hospital investigation forced him to read, in black and white, exactly how differently he had treated the people working under him, and that the hardest part was realizing that the man he had humiliated in front of his coworkers, the man he had once ordered to empty his pockets in a hallway, over nothing at all, was the very same man who had saved a child's life at real risk to his own. "I was wrong about you," Roger said, "and I was wrong in a way that could have gotten a child killed, if you had let my mistake stop you from doing the right thing anyway. I told myself for years that I treated everybody the same, right up until I had to sit in a room and listen to Terrence and Patricia describe exactly how differently I treated people, and there was no arguing with it because it was all just sitting there in black and white. I do not expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to hear me say it." Samuel studied him for a long moment, then said quietly that forgiveness was not something owed on demand, but that change meant more to him than any apology ever could, and if Roger truly meant what he said, he should spend the rest of his career making sure no one else on that floor was ever treated the way he had treated Samuel and Terrence both. Meanwhile, Julian Hartman spent the following weeks doing exactly what Samuel had asked of him. He reinstated Samuel with back pay for the time he had lost, and on Samuel's first morning back, Terrence Boyd and Patricia Long were both waiting for him at the employee entrance, before his shift even started, Terrence holding a cup of coffee he had bought, without being asked, and Patricia hugging him, so hard he nearly dropped it, telling him that the whole floor had missed him, and that nobody, not one single person, believed for a second he had done anything wrong that night. Rather than scatter his response across a dozen separate gestures, Julian put almost everything behind a single program, the Lakeside Invisible Workers Initiative, which raised wages for every support staff member in the building by $4 an hour, funded continuing education for aides and technicians who wanted to advance, established a mandatory annual review built specifically to catch patterns like Roger's, before they could fester for 2 years, and set aside a modest emergency fund for staff facing exactly the kind of medical crisis Samuel's mother was living through. The one thing Julian kept separate was a small medical scholarship he created in Angela Dawson's name, open to any frontline hospital worker in the city who wanted to pursue a career in medicine, and he never asked Samuel's permission before choosing that name, because some things a person does not need permission to honor. 3 months after the initiative launched, Julian stood in front of nearly 400 hospital employees in the main auditorium and told the entire story out loud, the 2 years of anonymous donations, the crisis, the firing, and his own failure to ever learn the name of the man saving his son, and he said publicly that a hospital, which allowed a pattern of unfair treatment to run for years, without consequence was not truly saving anyone, no matter how much technology it had in the building. "We built a company on the promise that a machine could catch what a tired human eye might miss," Julian told the room, "and it took me 2 years, and a fired employee to understand that no piece of software on earth will ever replace the simple discipline of actually looking at the person standing in front of you and asking them their name." Terrence Boyd stood up that day for the first time and spoke in front of his coworkers about what the last 2 years had felt like, and Patricia Long stood beside him the whole time, and near the back of the room, Roger Ellis sat quietly, no longer allowed to look away. Samuel's mother, Ruth, received a kidney transplant 4 months later, the costs quietly covered through that same emergency fund, and Samuel had a very good guess about who had made sure her paperwork moved to the front of the line, though he never once asked, because he understood anonymous giving better than almost anyone alive. The following afternoon, Julian brought Samuel up to the 7th floor to see Elijah properly for the first time in the daylight. "Mr. Samuel, you are here in the daytime," the boy said, delighted, because to him Samuel had only ever existed after dark. "Buddy," Julian said, kneeling beside the bed, "you know how you always talk about the blood man. He is standing right here." Elijah looked at Samuel, then at his father, then back at Samuel again, his eyes going wide, with the particular wonder that only exists in very young children, who have not yet learned to be careful with their feelings. "You are the blood man, and the story man," he said. "You are two people." Samuel laughed, a sound that was half laughter, and half something closer to grief finally letting go. "No, sweetheart," he said, "I am just one person. I just do two things." Elijah opened his arms, and Samuel crossed the room, and held him the way he had once held his own wife in her final months, tightly and completely present, and Julian stood behind them, with tears running freely down his face, understanding without needing anyone to explain it, that he was witnessing something sacred. Elijah reached under his pillow, and pulled out the same drawing, soft and worn now, from months of handling. "This is you," he said. "I made it, before I even knew who you were, because somehow I always knew you would come." The years between, that afternoon in room 714, and the day Samuel finally walked across the graduation stage were not easy ones. He spent the first year taking the science prerequisite courses he needed at a community college 2 nights a week, still working full shifts at the very same hospital that had once suspended him, now welcomed back, as an unofficial mentor to other aides. He spent the following year studying for the medical college admission test in whatever hour he could find, failing his first practice exam badly enough that he nearly gave up, and there were more than a few weeks when he sat at his kitchen table wondering whether he was too old, too tired, too far removed from the version of himself who had once dreamed this same dream at 26. What kept him going, he would say later, was a drawing taped above his desk of a stick figure, with brown skin, and big hands holding a red heart, and a boy who called him every few months just to talk, and a mother who lived long enough, thanks to a transplant she never stopped being grateful for, to see him get his acceptance letter, with the same fierce pride she had once carried her own hopes for him with, decades earlier, before either of them had any idea how long the road back would be. For years of medical school followed, paid for in large part by the very scholarship that carried his late wife's name, and on the day he finally walked across a stage at the University of Illinois College of Medicine wearing a black gown and a green hood, 48 years old, what he received that afternoon was his Doctor of Medicine degree, nothing more official than that yet, because a pediatric residency and a hematology fellowship still lay ahead of him, 3 more years, and then 2 more, after that, before he would formally earn the title everyone in his life had already been giving him for years, without waiting for the paperwork to catch up. In the audience, Elijah Hartman, 8 years old now, tall and healthy, and laughing, sat between his father and a woman named Ruth Dawson, who had traveled from Chicago in a wheelchair, but insisted on standing, just for a moment, when her son's name was called. And near the back of the auditorium sat Roger Ellis, no longer a supervisor, but now a mentor in the hospital's employee training program, who had spent the last 4 years trying, quietly and without asking for credit, to make sure no other worker in that building was ever treated the way he had once treated the man now walking across that stage. When it was over, Elijah ran up to Samuel holding a piece of paper, so worn at the edges it had nearly come apart, the same crayon drawing, brown skin, big hands, a bright red heart, carried and protected for years by a boy who never once forgot who had saved him. Samuel held that drawing for a long moment before he hugged Elijah back, thinking, as he often did on days that mattered, of Angela, of the wedding vows she could barely get through laughing, of the 18 months of strangers giving pieces of themselves so she could have a few more weeks, and he understood, standing there in his cap and gown with a child's crayon drawing pressed against his chest, that somehow, in a roundabout way, that no one could have planned, she had gotten him here. After all, this story never had a villain who stayed a villain, only ordinary people making ordinary mistakes inside broken systems, and one man who was forced to look directly at the harm he had caused and, to his credit, chose to spend the rest of his life trying to repair it instead of running from it. There is a lesson buried in this story that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with attention, because Julian Hartman had $4,200,000,000 and could not see the man saving his son's life until an accident of overheard conversation forced him to look, and Roger Ellis carried a quiet prejudice for years, without ever calling it by its real name, until the consequences of it were laid out in front of him in black and white, and Samuel Dawson, who had every reason to become bitter, chose instead to keep giving away pieces of himself to strangers, who would never know his name, because his grandmother had taught him that the measure of a person is not what they have, but what they are willing to give, when nobody is watching. Ruth Dawson lived to see her son become a doctor, and she liked to tell anyone who would listen that the transplant she received had come from a stranger too, someone she would never get to thank by name, which meant that in the end her family had been saved by exactly the same quiet, anonymous kindness that Samuel had spent his whole life giving away to other people, a small, closed circle that neither of them had planned, but both of them recognized the moment they understood it. Terrence Boyd eventually became a supervisor himself, and the first thing he did in that role was throw out the old scheduling system Roger had used and replace it with one that assigned rooms by rotation instead of by favor, so that no employee would ever again wonder whether the hardest hallway on the floor had been handed to them, because of who they were rather than what the job required. Ask yourself honestly, when you last stopped to truly see the person who cleans your building, or drives your bus, or holds your parents' hand in a hospital room at 3 in the morning, because that person, ordinary and unnoticed, and underpaid, might be the only thing standing between someone you love and the edge of losing them completely. Prejudice rarely announces itself with a raised fist. It usually shows up quietly, in who gets the easy schedule, and who gets the hard one, and the only real defense against it is the same thing that saved Elijah Hartman's life in the first place: one person deciding, on a random Tuesday night, that another human being's suffering was worth stopping for, even when nobody was watching, even when it cost something real. If this story moved you even a little, take 30 seconds today, and actually learn the name of someone you walk past every single day, without noticing, and if you have a rare blood type sitting and used in your veins, consider becoming exactly the kind of stranger this story was built around, because somewhere in a city not so different from Chicago, there is a child right now waiting on a stranger just like you to finally show up. And somewhere in your own life there is very likely a Samuel Dawson already doing the saving, quietly, without credit, waiting only for someone to finally notice.
If this story reminded you of someone who showed up for you when nobody else did, send it to them right now. They probably do not hear it often enough. And if you are still watching, drop a comment and tell me what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you are from.
Hit subscribe and turn on the bell, because tomorrow's story is one you simply cannot miss. See you in the next one.